point we are born again, God does something miraculous in us. He shuts down our sin nature. The Renewed Mind series, I'm telling you some things right now that you may not have known. When you're born again, God shuts down the sin nature in you. Somebody say, well, I must be broken because I do sinning fine. What is that? Well, I want you to do this. I want you to picture with me, picture like a General Motors factory or a Chrysler factory where they build cars. This factory's up and running and they're pumping out cars, and these cars then go out on the roadways of our nation. But you know, during times of maybe economic stress or something, every once in a while, General Motors will shut down one of their factories. That factory's not producing cars anymore. But guess what? The cars that they already produced, they're still on the road. And so our journey in Christianity, even though the sin nature has been shut down, the habits that we have formed in our sin nature, the issues that we have in our sin nature they're still driving around the roadways of my soul. And they express themselves in my body. My body does a real good job of expressing the sin nature cars that are still on the road of Jody's soul. And so that's what that journey is. And that's why we have to stay in the game with God. That's why we stay in the Word, so that our soul can continually be saved and grow and more transformation happen and until we're shaped into the image of God. That's why we need our mind renewed. Because I tell people, you know, if you have smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day for the last 30 years. And part of your ritual was at the end of a meal, you go smoke a cigarette. And you come up here today and are radically saved at the altar. Guess what? After lunch, you know what you're probably still going to want? A cigarette. It's those cars driving around the roadways of your soul, right? And so we're going to be patient with you. We're going to help you, and we're going to walk. The Lord's going to walk you through those things as we grow in the health of our soul. But what's happening in our soul expresses itself often in our bodies. In the flesh, a couple things you need to know about the flesh. The flesh is very powerful. Our flesh, this carnal part of me. First of all, you need to understand that our flesh is driven by desire. It's driven by desires, by appetites, by things. I know you guys aren't like this, but this is what happens with me. I just want things that I want. Independent of God, my flesh has appetites. And the second thing you need to know about the flesh is it's really powerful because you can feel it. And if I preach too long, we'll see that happen as your appetite for lunch. Right? So our flesh has these desires, these wants, and it's amplified in our feelings. And so the flesh is constantly crying out like feed me, feed me, feed me. That's the picture of sowing seed into the field of our flesh. When we give in to those fleshly desires, the things that I just want, don't care what God thinks, don't want to know what God thinks. I know what God thinks and don't care. This is what I want. When we do that, what we're doing is we're sowing into the field of our flesh, and we know what the harvest is for such sowing. But you know, the enemy tries to trick us, and often when our flesh has these desires, it tells us, you know, the enemy will join with our own natural thinking and say, but you know what, if you'll just satisfy that desire, that appetite, it'll go away. But how many of you know when you feed that appetite, it doesn't go away, it grows. It grows. That's the reason why they call in our society, this wasn't, Christians didn't name this, the secular culture named this. It said that marijuana is a gateway drug. Right? Because you rarely stop there. That's just the entrance, but that appetite continues to grow, and the drugs become harder and harder, and they move you into more and more, and it begins to bring a harvest of death and decay and destruction in your life. Nobody started drugs shooting up heroin right off the bat. No, it was a slow evolution. And years ago, I had the opportunity to lead worship for a mission trip into inner city Philadelphia. Now, I don't know, when I say inner city Philadelphia, I don't know what image pops in your mind, but when I got there, what I saw was a true representation of what my mind had imagined inner city Philadelphia would look like. We were actually ministering on this street, where on this street they had the L. Have you ever heard of that? It's the elevated train. Have you seen that on the movies? Where the train drives up over the street. And on every street corner in this neighborhood, there was prostitutes and pimps and drug dealers. There was bodegas, and it was just the epitome of everything your mind can imagine about this neighborhood. And the reason we were there ministering was because there was a missionary who actually moved his family to this neighborhood. Now listen to me. This neighborhood was the #1 heroin producing neighborhood in the Northeast. And when you walked the streets, you saw the living dead. It was so heartbreaking to watch the people there. And I remember this missionary told me this story. He said, there was a man who showed up in this neighborhood one day. And this man was well put together. He dressed well. He had a good job. He had a good car. He had a good family. He had a good life. But he started hanging around this neighborhood. And after hanging around this neighborhood, we saw him lose his job. We saw him lose his car. We saw him lose his family. We saw his appearance change until the fact that that man was living on the streets in that neighborhood. Listen, the first time he showed up in that neighborhood, he wasn't imagining that he would be living on the street in that neighborhood. But here's what you need to know. Sin will always take you further than you wanted to go. It'll always keep you longer than you wanted to stay, and it'll always cost you more than you wanted to pay. It just does. But the enemy somehow tells us that, I can do these things. I can just gratify this desire, this lust. I know this isn't what God wants me to do, but this is what I want to do. We see this in pornography. I know this is church service, but listen, pornography is prevalent enough in our society that we don't need to be afraid to talk about it in the church. See this, first time, pornography is viewed. I mean, it could be something as simple as the Victoria's Secret magazine, and it's pornography to you. But after a while, that's not enough. And pornography will always go deeper. It'll go darker. It'll get more perverted, because the nature of this is sin will always move you in that direction. It always equals death and decay. Church, don't sow to the flesh. We can't live our lives, even though we're born again, we can't live our lives just giving in to the whims, the desires, the appetites of our flesh, because it won't produce in you what you think it'll produce. And guess what? Our churches are full of people sometimes who we spend our days sowing to the flesh, and then we come to church on Sunday and beg God for his blessing when we've spent our life sowing into the field of our flesh, trying to get God to give us a different harvest than where we've been sowing, and it doesn't work. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. You sow to the flesh, you reap death and destruction. I'm sorry, guys. Are we okay? I just felt like I needed to say this to you this morning. Because here's what culture's telling us. This is where the Renewed Mind series comes in. Because what culture's telling us is, hey, just give in to that. If you feel it, then you need to give expression to it. I mean, if that's what you want, then it's not just what you should do, it's who you are. What it's saying is, if you have these desires, that desire is your identity. And I want to say to you, listen, if your identity matches the desires of your flesh, you're in for a long, long, hard road. Because here's what I know, is that my identity is not tied to my flesh. My identity is tied to the cross of Jesus Christ, who has set me free from those things.